Welcome to Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. I'm Dr. Boyd Schlenther, Emeritus Reader in History at Aberystwyth University. And last October 2021, it was my pleasant privilege to speak here at Wondrously. And what now follows is a re-recording of that lecture. Francis Kilvert's Bath. Why do I keep this voluminous journal? I can hardly tell. Partly because life seems to me such a curious and wonderful thing that it almost seems a pity that even such a humble and uneventful life as mine should pass altogether away without some such record as this. Indeed, on the face of it, this appears to be a predictable and uneventful life, and it might be wondered why it should command our attention. But, as many of us will know, the Reverend Francis Kilvert kept diaries that paint a remarkably vivid portrait of the life of mid-Victorian rural society, but also non-rural society, especially here in Bath. Many diaries are a celebration of self, a loving pilgrimage of prose paced round the author. However, the finest diaries observe not themselves, but others and their surroundings. Kilvert's diaries, now one of the most admired of English diaries, fall firmly into the latter class. As one writer puts it, Kilvert gave his writing a vividness and a simplicity shared by few similar journals, making it both a major document of Victorian life and a moving work of literature. His Wordsworthian sensibility found expression in a delicious prose devoted to delicate depictions of nature, but he was also winsome in his poignant descriptions of others. In Kilvert's nimble hands, both are facets of the same gem. Last year marked the 150th anniversary of his commencing his diary entries which continued for 9 years. These began when he was a curate in the village of Clerical, just a mile north of Hay-on-Wye. It was here where his descriptive passages, his attunement with nature, reached poetic heights. His evocations of the Wye Valley and the Welsh border are classics of landscape writing. He walked miles and miles and miles through all weathers to visit his flocks and schools, or just to see places or people who took his fancy. He was forever out and about, villaging, as he called it, and this was the main reason for his effectiveness and his popularity. He would go from cottage to cottage and farm to farm, chatting with people wherever he could find them, meeting them in lanes and fields, in their kitchens, up a ladder, ill in bed. Time and again, he records villaging all the afternoon, or a long round of visits in the parish. One September day, he was out in the rain morning and afternoon, recording in his diary the names of 28 people he had been with in that single day. Kilvert was remarkably well positioned to open to us windows into the life both of the gentry and the humblest of his parishioners, and remarkably, he was comfortably at home with both, and his entrenched gentleness saw that no one was too insignificant for him to be kind to. In all these writings, his descriptions of the stuff and scruff of everyday life become passages of strikingly memorable prose, musical prose, that often unconsciously becomes poetry. In Kilvert's hands, a touch of quiet magic. His years at Clerical, especially, were passed in a kind of Wordsworthian dream, in love with both the land and the people. And the creative circuitry of his writing is wired directly to his keen, observant eye. That eye was equipped not only with the vocabulary, but also the grammar to express with precision. As I sit writing in my bedroom and looking from the window at the glorious morning spread upon the mountains, the Wye Valley is filled full of mist from side to side. Out of the great white fog sea rises an island ridge of trees about Wye Cliff, and the great solitary fir stands up like an isolated rock and stems the tide of the rolling mist. Everything is swamped and gone down in the bright rolling flood, which tosses and heaves and seems to dash itself in spray against the mountainsides. Or this passage, which V.S. Pritchard said reminded him of a Constable painting. It was a glorious afternoon, unclouded, and the meadows shone dazzling like a golden sea in the glory of the sheets of buttercups. The deep, dark river, still and glassy, seemed to be asleep and motionless, except where a leaf or blossom floated slowly by. The cattle by the mill splashed and trampled among the rushes and river flags and water lilies in the shallow places. And Miller Godwin, in a white hat, came down with a bucket to draw water from the pool. Serene and lucid images, and as a writer, Kilvert had that marvellous verbal eye, perhaps two verbal eyes, capable of frequently changing lenses with ease, panoramic views, landscapes, then portraits, images melting from one to the other. At length we came in sight of a little hollow, a recess in the hills, a little coombe running back into the mountain, closed at the end and on both sides by the steep hillsides, but open in the south, and the sun and the great valley of the Wye and the distant blue mountains. A sunny, green little coombe it was, secluded deep among the steep green hills, and until you came close to it, you would not be suspecting the existence of the place. A well-watered little coombe with sweet waters from the upper and lower springs, which welled up through the turf and peat and ferns and heathers, and joining their rills, trickled away in a tiny stream down the coombe to form a brook. In this green coombe stood a little grey hut. It was built of rough, dry stone without mortar, and the thatch was thin and broken. Not a soul was stirring or in sight on the hill or in the valley, and as we turned the corner of the little grey hut and came in sight of the closed door, we believed that our pilgrimage had been in vain. Then what was my relief when I knocked upon the door to hear a strange, deep voice from within saying, "Ho, ho!" There was a slight stir within. Then the cabin door opened and a strange figure came out. The figure of a man rather below the middle height, about 60 years of age, his head covered with a luxuriant growth of light brown or chestnut hair, and his face made remarkable by a mild, thoughtful, melancholy blue eye and red moustache and white beard. The hermit was dressed in a seedy, faded, greasy suit of black, a dress coat, and a large untidy white cravat, or a cravat that had once been white. Upon his feet he wore broken low shoes, and in his hand he carried a tall hat. He had a distant, absent look and a preoccupied air, as if the soul were entirely unconscious of the rags in which the body was clothed. The house was a sight, when once seen, never to be forgotten. I sat in amazement, taking mental notes of the strangest interior I ever saw. Inside the hut, there was a wild confusion of litter and rubbish, almost choking and filling up all available space. The floor had once been of stone, but was covered thick and deep with an accumulation of the dirt and peat dust of years. The furniture consisted of 2 wooden saddle-seated chairs, polished smooth by the friction of continual sessions, and one of them without a back. a four-legged dressing table littered with broken bread, meat, crumbs, dirty knives and forks, glasses, plates, cups and saucers in squalid hugger-mugger confusion. In heaps and piles upon the floor were old books, large Bibles, commentaries, reports of all sorts. The floor was further encumbered with beams and logs of wood, flower pans covered over, and old chests. All the other articles of food were hung up on pothooks, some from the ceiling, some in the chimney, out of the way of the rats. The squalor, the dirt, the dust, the foulness and wretchedness of the place were indescribable, almost inconceivable. And in this cabin thus lives the Reverend John Price, Master of Arts of Cambridge University and Vicar of Painscastle. Gosh. There is much in the diary that points to Kilvert's impulsive personality, not least when he chronicles his remarkable propensity for falling in love, sometimes without even knowing the object of his affections. Here in Bath, at an 1873 meeting of the annual Church of England Congress, an angel came into the Congress Hall and stood at the door listening. It had taken the form of a very beautiful young girl in a long grey cloak and a shower of golden brown hair. I watched her intently, and as she bowed her head and knee at the name of names, she assumed exactly the attitude and appearance of the angels that overshadowed with their wings the ark and the mercy seat. In the perpetual struggle between the powers and principles of good and evil, the obeisants rebuked and put to flight an evil thought. Kilvert seemed almost incapable of self-analysis, and we must pause here to consider what has troubled some. He records in voluptuously detailed detail the young girls he taught in school. It's a spirited work here, not entirely dissimilar to that of Lewis Carroll's. In one school, Kilvert offered a young girl kisses for every mathematical sum she got right. Yet, just as we become uneasy, we read his entry describing a visit to a deaf and dumb child. When I opened the door of the poor old crazy cottage, the girl uttered a passionate, inarticulate cry of joy, and running to me, she flung her arms round my neck and covered me with kisses. Well, I have lived, and I have been loved, and no one can take this from me. And this naive, highly romanticized innocence keeps such passages within the context of what really motivated him. It was a fair sight to watch the merry girls with their pretty white feet and bare limbs wading through the little rippling waves or walking on the wet and shining sand. As I watched them, there came over me such a longing, such a hungry yearning to have one of those children for my own. Oh, that I too had a child to love and to love me, a daughter with such fair limbs and blue eyes archly dancing, and bright clustering curls blown wild and golden in the sunshine and sea air. It came over me like a storm, and I turned away hungry at heart. In stark contrast, the diary has frequent flashes of humour and self-deprecation. At the scripture lesson at the school this morning, asking Eleanor Williams about paradise, what happened on Palm Sunday? She replied, Jesus Christ went up to heaven on an ass. This is the promising result of a long struggle to teach her something about the festivals of the church. I walked across to Kington St. Michael to be present at the school feast. As we were swinging the children, a girl came up to me with a beseeching look in her eyes and an irresistible request for a swing. She was a perfect little beauty, with a plump, rosy face, dark hair, and lovely, soft, dark eyes, melting with tenderness, and a sweet little mouth, as pretty as a rosebud. I lifted her into the swing, and away she went. But about the sixth flight, the girl suddenly slipped off the swing seat, feet foremost, and still keeping hold of the ropes, she hung from the swing, helpless. Unfortunately, her clothes had got hitched upon the seat of the swing and were all pulled up round her waist. And it instantly became apparent that she wore no drawers. A titter and then a shout of laughter ran through the crowd as the girl's plump person was seen naked, hanging from the swing. We hustled her out of the swing and got her clothes into their proper place as soon as possible. I believe it was partly my fault. When I lifted the girl into the swing, there were many aspirants for the seat, and in the struggle and confusion, I suppose I set her down with her clothes rumpled up and her bare flesh upon the board. And as her flesh was plump and smooth and the board slippery, they managed to part company with this result. Poor child. When she begged earnestly for a swing, she scarcely contemplated the exhibition of herself for the amusement of the spectators. Who then was Francis Kilvert? Can we get behind the beard? And what was it that linked him to Bath? In 1782, a clan of Kilverts had descended here from Shropshire. In due course, Kilvert's grandfather, a man of fluctuating fortune, set up a coach building business in Kingsmead Street, just off Kingsmead Square. He and his wife had several children. This veritable colony, this cluster of Kilverts, occupied a significant portion of the Caroline buildings, a terrace of late Regency houses that adjoins the Kennet and Avon Canal in Widcombe. Our diarist's father Robert and his uncle Francis were among those children who grew up there. Both men were key to our diarist's development. Both became clergymen. Indeed, the diary, as well as Kilvert's life, was chock full of clerics, and he seemed destined for the church. Born in 1840 in Hardenhuish, Wiltshire, where his father Robert was vicar, his formal education was at Claverton Lodge School, here in Bath, taught by his uncle Francis. We must pause here to tip an historical hat, since during his day this uncle was the most noted of the Kilverts, a prominent scholarly figure here in Bath, an essayist known sometimes as the Antiquary. He himself was Bath-born, educated at King Edward's School. So, our diarist studied with this uncle and lodged at Claverton Lodge, spending his most formative years in close contact with this learned and literary Bathonian, who, among other pursuits, was a keen poet and student of poetry. And this most likely explains our diarist's extraordinary familiarity with a wide range of English poets, and engendered in him that poetic grace which graces so much of his prose. From 1816 until his death, nearly half a century later, this other Francis Kilvert tutored students. In 1830, he bought Darlington Court on North Road behind Sydney Gardens, where he had 20 pupils. The following year, he was appointed curate at Claverton, and in 1837 became rector there. His income from teaching enabled him to buy Claverton Lodge, an old, impressive house which stands at the entrance to Claverton Manor, aka the American Museum. Among other clerical responsibilities, Uncle Francis became evening lecturer at St. Mary's Church, Bathwick. Indeed, he, together with other Kilverts, is memorialised in St. Mary's. He also lectured in Bath Abbey. Now, the punchline to all this is that right from its birth in 1824, For 40 years, Uncle Francis was a leading figure in Bath's leading intellectual society. A regular member of its steering committee, he was a frequent lecturer to its members, lectures with titles ranging from the study of Hebrew, Ralph Allen and Prior Park, the Bath Eastern vase, Alexander Pope and his connection with the west of England, to on the advantages derivable from institutions for the promotion of literature and the arts. I hope we've made Uncle Francis feel at home here this evening at his very own literary and scientific institution. Throughout his life, our diarist nursed and nurtured much of the literary inspiration he had received at Cleverton, focusing on the poetry of Tennyson and Wordsworth, especially Wordsworth. He was to go on to become a keen reader of Scott, Dickens and Trollope. Later he read Mrs. Gaskell, at least her, for the time, startling novel Ruth. It was his response to lonely places that brought him close to Wordsworth. He loved the emptiness, the mystery, where heaven and earth seemed to meet. Later, in his diary, he wrote, "I like wandering about these lonely, wasted and ruined places. There dwell among them a spirit of quiet and gentle melancholy, more congenial and akin to my own spirit than full life and gaiety and noise." His life was to prove an arresting combination of solitude and sociability. He went up to Wadham College, Oxford, and graduated in 1862. Following his ordination and so firmly grafted into his family tree, Kilvert served for 2 years as his father's curate in Langley Borough, Wiltshire, and then as curate in Cliro, Radnorshire. Then he returned for further curacy under his father in Langley Borough for another 4 years. In 1876, he was appointed vicar of St. Harmon, Radnorshire, where he remained for just over a year, finally to be inducted vicar of Bredwardine, Herefordshire, at the end of 1877. And during these years of ministry in various parishes, Francis Kilvert had frequent occasion to frequent Bath. The recent spread of the railways certainly made Kilvert a far more mobile minister than previously would have been possible. Here was the new age's rapid transit, and Kilvert came to Bath for a variety of reasons. He visited his dentist, Charles Gain, at 8 Edgar Buildings, whose current and very recent manifestation is as Persephone Books. He stayed at 13 Raby Place with his sister and her husband, yet another clergyman, who was master of the Bath Proprietary College, aka the Holborn Museum. He lunched with that sister at Fort's on Milsom Street, the makers of Bath Oliver biscuits, and for many years a noted restaurant, now living life as Waterstones. He had his hair, but apparently not his beard, cut by Robert Collins at 12 New Bond Street. After the diary's first publication in 1938, there were efforts to find anyone still alive who had known Kilvert, and one of the few was an elderly man. "Yes, I do mind Mr. Kilvert, quiet gentleman, great black beard, like a foreign gentleman, as my father used to say. No, we don't see such gentlemen nowadays, nor such beards." Numerous were the times Kilvert stayed at Raby Place with his sister and her family. On one occasion, his sister had recently given birth and had had a bad night last night, disturbed continually by the passing of trains under that row of houses. Again, in January 1873, a tempestuous night and a wild, wet morning wrapped in an appalling gloom. At Raby Place, we were obliged to have the gas lighted at breakfast at 9 o'clock. We heard today that the excessive rain has caused the sewers of Lansdowne Hill to overflow, and the sewage has polluted the Bath Western wells and reservoirs, so that many people have been poisoned and have died of typhus fever. On another visit, my sister met me at Fort's, leading Florence by the hand, and the nurse followed. A band of wandering minstrels was playing in Milsom Street, and when we went in a shop, Florence stayed at the door and danced in the street to the music. Our diarist observed many wondrously quirky Bath sights. Went down to Bath by the 11 o'clock train, lunched at Fort's with my sister. In Milsom Street, we met a procession of horsemanship and circus riders in spangles and tawdry tinsel, dressed as Tartar horsemen in armour, preceded by the blasting and din of a brass band, huddled in a gilt cart, dragged by miserable piebald horses, and followed by a coarse-looking, dirty women rider. Upon a small pedestal, on top of a lofty painted car, stood an angel with white silver tinsel wings, which shone and flashed in the sun. It was a poor, pale, thin girl, with a flood of yellow hair and a worn, anxious face, with a terrified, unhappy look that went to one's heart. The rude jolting of the car made it very difficult for her to stand on her lofty perch, and she held on in a frightened way and looked round and down anxiously. In the procession rode a very little man with an enormous and ridiculous mask and false head covered with a mane of coarse, tawny hair. This infamous creature, part lion, part monkey, part devil, sat on his skewbald horse during a pause in the march, and set all Milsom Street on a roar with his ludicrous and filthy gestures. On yet another visit, at the door of the White Lion Hotel in High Street, Kilvert found a large crowd gathered round the donkey and cart of the nobleman organ grinder, who, dressed in disguise, was staying at the hotel. Some say he is an Irish baronet, some that he is a lord. It is believed that he has made a wager for £30,000 that he will go about for 3 years with the same donkey and live by his earnings organ grinding. People give him gold in the street, and some days it is said he makes as much as £15. Kilvert's Bath visits were invariably by train. When the box tunnel was opened, for some while a number of passengers would detrain at the station before the tunnel, travel over the hill by Chase to take a later train at the next station. We may smile at this, as Brunel did at the time, but that great black hole below Box Hill, at nearly 2 miles, was then the world's longest tunnel. To be plunged into it at 40 or 50 miles an hour would certainly test otherwise hearty nerves. Indeed, a mid-19th century guide to the Great Western Railway advised ladies to screw up their nerve for a rush through the box tunnel. And here is Kilvert's diary entry for the 18th of May, 1870. Went down to the Bath Flower Show in Sydney Gardens. The carriage was nearly full. In the box tunnel, as there was no lamp, the people began to strike foul brimstone matches and hand them to each other all down the carriage. All the time we were in the tunnel, these lighted matches were travelling from hand to hand in the darkness. Each match lasted the length of the carriage, and the red ember was thrown out of the opposite window, by which time another lighted match was seen travelling down the carriage. The carriage was choke full of brimstone fumes, and by the time we got out of the tunnel, I was almost suffocated. Then a gentleman tore a lady's pocket handkerchief in two, seized one fragment, blew his nose with it, and put the rag in his pocket. She then seized his hat from his head, while another lady said that the dogs of Wootton Bassett were much more sociable than the people. At the flower show, the tents were like furnaces, and the crowd so great that one saw everything but the flowers. At Bath Station, he had to struggle to a carriage with his arms full of parcels, one of the parcels being a hot, greasy pigeon pie, fresh from the oven, without any basket. This I carried in both hands from Chippenham Station to Langley. Kilvert frequently came to Bath accompanied by a family member. This morning I went to Bath with my mother and got into the horticultural show cool and early. The crowd moved very slowly, and one gentleman with an eyeglass examined every rose carefully and deliberately, keeping us standing a quarter of an hour at one box of roses until I rebuked him. Southgate Street was splendid with flags, a beautiful sight. The middle and lower classes of people at the flower show were extremely well-mannered. Yet someone of an unknown class of people could be extremely ill-mannered, as on another occasion met my mother at the station. She had just had her pocket picked on the platform at Bath and had lost her handkerchief, purse and 10 shillings. Kilvert was far from impressed by the condition of Prior Park. We went boldly in at the lodge gates and made our way unchallenged past the long, damp, dreary ranges of ugly buildings, half barrack, half jail, till we came round to the garden front and the great portico looking over Bath. The shrubbery through which we passed was tangled, wild, and overgrown with long neglect. 2 ecclesiastics in cassocks and berettas tramped up and down the grand terrace walk, smoking, laughing, and spitting right and left. From the vast portico, where Pope, Allen, and Warburton used to sit and talk, the view over Bath and the valley is said to be glorious on a fine summer evening at sunset, and I can quite believe it. Prior Park has been a magnificent place, but the glory is departed, and the days of Ralph Allen are no more. It would take a large fortune to keep the place in repair and beauty. At present, the great stones of the noble flight of terrace steps are sadly broken and shattered, and the gardens, lawns, and shrubberies seem to be going to ruin and decay. In 1874, Kilvert was told that at a recent general election at the polling station at St. Saviour's School in Lark Hall, a political radical was boasting and vapouring about, saying he wasn't going to have any Tory lords. And to that end, he had taken good care to cross off the Tory candidate. At which a crowd gathered round him. "Why, what have you done?" they said. "I put a cross against Lord Grey de Wilton's name," he said. "I crossed him off." "Why, you stupid fool," they cried, "then you've been and voted for him." The thunderstruck man burst into the polling booth, demanding a fresh voting paper. Of course refused, the man rushed home, the mob running along with him, the Conservatives cheering him derisively, and the Radicals hooting and hissing him. He would never hear the last of his vote and the way in which he had crossed out the Tory Lord. We've come to note the presence of St. Mary's Church in Bathwick in the ongoing Kilvert saga, so close to his sister's house at Raby Place. And on one occasion, Kilvert had performed a wedding ceremony at St. Mary's. Oh, to have been there. Stiles the clerk produced a surplice that barely covered my knees. I said, "That is a chorister's surplice." "No," said the clerk, "the clergy here are very small." "Then get me a cassock. Mr. Walson's will do." Mr. Walson has left the parish. The clerk, however, produced 3 cassocks, all very small, and struggled fiercely like a lion to get them on me, but one after another cracked so ominously and tore so alarmingly that we were obliged to desist. What he managed to wear, we are not told. Kilvert was unusually tall, and viewing the picture we have of him seated, it does look as if he was struggling in the attempt to find somewhere to fit his feet. In 1872, Kilvert learned that the remarkable Anglican monk Joseph Lyne, self-styled as Father Ignatius, had created a sensation in Bathwick. He and one of his monks had come to St. Mary's for Holy Communion. Bound by a vow not to look at any woman, the two men appeared so very odd, coming very fast up the aisle against the stream of people just pouring out of church. All the young ladies' eyes were on them, but the monk's eyes were never raised from the ground. Moreover, reports Kilvert, they live on vegetables and dates entire in Lent and look very ill. In 1875, on one of his not infrequent visits to Charles Gane, the dentist, Kilvert had an hour to spare and went into St. John's Roman Catholic Church behind Manvers Street. I knelt in the church and prayed for charity, unity and brotherly love, and the union of Christendom. Surely a Protestant may pray in a Catholic church and be none the worse. Now, what makes this passage all the more striking is that just 5 years earlier in Rome, the First Vatican Council had pronounced the dogma of papal infallibility. It was such a fresh and fervent issue at this very time, one that caused some consternation even among many Roman Catholics. And 3 years later, in Bath, once again, while waiting for the train, I spent a quiet, solemn half-hour in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, none of this suggests that Kilvert was hankering after Rome. Not long after his first visit to St. John's, his diary records disquieting rumours of Romanist tendencies in the Church of England. What his 2 visits to meditate in St. John's does suggest is an ironically minded man who ever sought the peaceful path. Not all of Kilvert's references to Bath paint the city's profile to its best advantage. Upon revisiting Bristol, where he had been ordained, he mused that it is a grand city, how much grander than Bath. I breathe freely here. Here is life, movement and work, instead of the foolish drawl and idle lounge. Yet before we rise up in wounded protest that anyone could possibly hold such wrong-headed views, Kilvert comes back with this as his train approaches. Just before we got into Bath, a sunbeam stole across the world and lighted the Queen of the West with the ethereal beauty of a fairy city, while all the land blazed gorgeous with brilliant and many-coloured trees. Almost in a moment, the dull, dark leaden sky was replaced by a sheet of brilliant blue, and the lively city shone dazzling and lustrous upon the hillsides, her palaces veiled with a tender mist and softened by delicate gleams of pearl and blue. Or, on another occasion, I think I never saw the beautiful city look lovelier than this morning in its early morning dress, with the blue circling hills climbed by crescents and terraces, and the great abbey towering above the river and looming across the river meads. I'm sure that we, whether Bathonian or barbarian, can luxuriate in such a word painting and forgive Kilvert his Bristolian lapse. Nonetheless, we must conclude that Kilvert's love of Bath was perhaps more for its appearance than for its inhabitants. We've noted our diarist's romantic impulses, but not all of his romances were conducted at a kind of yearning distance. 2 were serious enough to lead him and the young lady involved to plan marriage. Etty is one of the most striking-looking and handsomest girls I've seen for a long time. Her dress set off her exquisite figure and suited to perfection her black hair and eyes and her dark Spanish brunette complexion with its rich glow of health, which gave her cheeks the dusky bloom and flush of a ripe pomegranate. But both this and the other planned marriage were scuppered by the lady's unwilling parents. In fact, the woman he finally married in August 1879 was his fourth choice of wife, less than 2 years after he had become vicar of Bredwardine. Elizabeth Rowland was not perhaps one of the most striking-looking and handsomest girls Kilvert had ever seen, but she was set fair to fill the role of a clergyman's wife and to give him the children he so longed for. Before his marriage, he came to Bath to purchase, among other things, a Kidderminster bedroom carpet and 2 copies of oil paintings. When he and his bride returned from their honeymoon, they found Bredwardine decorated with archways and poles wreathed with flowers, with a tea for the school children and the older people. When their carriage reached the bridge, the horses were dismissed, and the vicar and his bride were drawn by willing villagers' hands to the door of the vicarage. Following tributes and presentations, Kilvert spoke. "My dear friends, I am more than deeply touched by your kind reception, love and affection. If God spares me, I will try to deserve your affection and show you how deeply grateful I am for these kind efforts today." The following day was Sunday, and Kilvert conducted matins, but in the evening complained of being unwell. 9 days later, he died of peritonitis, aged 38, thereby silencing one of the 19th century's most evocative diarists. His marriage had lasted 5 weeks. So devastated was he by his son's death, Kilvert's father resigned from Langley Borough and, with his wife, moved to Bath to Beaufort East. But the father died within a couple of years. Someone has said that an ideal world would be one in which the things that happen to people happen to the people to whom they ought to happen. Diaries tend to exist on the fringes of pure literature and most often are valued for their historical and sociological evidence rather than for their literary merit. When a diary fulfills both functions, our minds and affections stand at attention. Most diarists produce voluminous detail, a great deal of which is merely voluminous, and fails to arrest that attention. Francis Kilvert was born to observe and to write, able to transform what might have been trivial records of daily experience into passages of strikingly memorable poetical prose. And he possessed an admirable inner editor. Moreover, and rather amazingly, despite the wear and tear of time, with Kilvert, the distance between him and us collapses. Of course, it helps that here in Bath we can physically touch what he touched, see what he saw. Yet most important is his voice. Though often using the language of yesteryear, he proves a strangely modern voice, allowing his past to seep into our present. And we can still understand him well. He is still wired into our mutual mental grid, and with him we can still feel the same emotional textures. People are far too apt to talk of the Victorian attitude to life. They forget that in Victorian times there were 1,000 different attitudes to life, just as there are today, or at any other time. It's often been popularly supposed that the tone of the time, the leading characteristics of the Victorian period were priggishness, prudishness, and gross materialism. No doubt these things were in ample evidence, but Francis Kilvert shows barely a trace of them. And consider his humour. We have seen him wrestling with St. Mary's wardrobe of cassocks, which he appears to have left in some disarray. This true touch of understated humour was never more appealingly present than when he went to Worcester Cathedral for the funeral of an aged maiden aunt. The body had been placed in a remarkably solid coffin, in effect two coffins, a lead coffin fitted into an outer one of dark oak. The chosen pallbearers were all leading ecclesiastics. Let Kilvert tell us. The coffin had been brought downstairs and was waiting in the hall, covered with the black velvet sweeping soft pall, white bordered. Boom went the great bell of the cathedral. Church was over, and someone said that they ought to have used the tenor bell, but they were using the great bell, and no mistake. Boom went the bell again. The coffin went out immediately, and the pallbearers filed out in pairs after it, taking their places and holding each his pall tassel on either side. My father and I followed as chief mourners in crape scarves and hatbands, all the rest in silk. The bearers had been selected not at all with reference to their fitness for the task, but with reference to the friendship entertained for them by the servants of the house. One of the bearers on the right side was very short, so short that he could not properly support the coffin level. The coffin seemed very heavy. As the procession moved across College Green to the cloister arch, the men staggered under the weight, and the coffin lurched and tilted to one side over the short bearer. One very fat man, who had constituted himself chiefest mourner of all, and walked next the coffin before my father and myself. The bearers, blinded by the sweeping pall, could not see where they were going, and nearly missed the cloister arch, but at length we got safe into the narrow dark passage and into the cloisters. The great bell boomed high overhead, and the deep trilling vibration hung trembling in the air long after the stroke of the bell. So the clergy and choir came to meet us at the door, then turned and moved up the cathedral nave, chanting in solemn procession, I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. But meanwhile there was a dreadful struggle at the steps leading up from the cloisters to the door. The bearers were quite unequal to the task, and the coffin seemed crushingly heavy. There was a stamping and a scuffling, a mass of struggling men swaying to and fro, pushing and writhing and wrestling, while the coffin sank and rose and sank again. Once or twice I thought the whole mass of men must have been down together with the coffin atop of them, and someone killed or maimed at least. But now came the time of the fat chief mourner. Seizing his opportunity, he rushed into the strife by an opening lodge, and the rescued coffin rose. At last, by a wild effort and tremendous heave, the ponderous coffin was borne up the steps and through the door into the cathedral, where the choristers, quite unconscious of the scene and fearful struggle going on behind, were singing up the nave like a company of angels. In the choir there was another dreadful struggle to let the coffin down. The bearers were completely overweighted. They bowed and bent and nearly fell and threw the coffin down on the floor. Little wonder that Virginia Woolf was so enthusiastic about the artistically descriptive quality of that passage. Kilvert wrote that it is a positive luxury to be alive. He was deeply committed in his faith, and yet he was some distance from being overly religious. It was God's creation and God's creatures that formed the central motif for the tapestry of Kilvert's observations and reflections, not any prettily pious appeals, and very little indeed about church organizations or theologies or disputes. Certainly serious about his faith, he was far from solemn about it. And incapable of religiosity, Here was a faithful man whose humanity was heightened, elevated by that faith, not dragged down by grudging growls at the modern world or by resentment at his having to live in it. He warmed the hands of his faith before the softly glowing fire of what he considered to be the Creator's creative creation, and in the process created his own verbal masterpiece, throbbing with verbal music. It was a magnetic combination of self-imposed restraint with tingling vivacity. Well, to whatever extent he was pleased with Bath, I hope that this evening Bath has taken some pleasure in him, that we have been in tune with the gracious grace notes his writing played. And I thank you for joining me in opening these remarkable diaries of the equally remarkable Reverend Francis Kilvert.